You're listening to GWP News Weekly. I'm your host, Isaac Hedges, joined once again by co-host Jacob Fulmer. And our top stories tonight, we'll be looking at a recent kidnapping, yesterday's Super Bowl, and the delay of the Artemis launch. All that and much more coming your way on GWP News Weekly. So, folks, you might have noticed, of course, the past couple of weeks we tried something a little bit different than we had before, where we would have segments, again, recorded separately. And we're trying something once again a little bit different. We are joined on the line, as you can tell. Co-host Jacob Fulmer does not join me here in the studio. He's joining us on the line on the road right now. So, Jake, it's great to hear you. And I hear that, of course, recently we had this story, very tragically and still very much an ongoing investigation with Savannah Guthrie. Savannah Guthrie, that is, the host of the Today Show, had her mother kidnapped. Again, it's still a search ongoing. So, very crazy situation. Jake, what do we know about that?
Well, we know at this point in time that she's been missing for about a week at this point in time, and that there's been multiple ransom notes that have been left, one of which has already been found to be false at this point in time. So the family is certainly really just kind of speculating, I would say, as to what possibly could have happened. But of course, the outcome is not looking good at this point in time because it's very unlikely that, at least at this point in time, that without her daily medication, that I mean, assuming that she hasn't had her daily medication throughout this entire ordeal, it's very unlikely that she's doing very well
Right,
at this
yes.
point in time, unfortunately. So, just a very tragic story that has happened.
Yes, it is certainly, Jake, as you mentioned. Sadly, it seems less and less likely now that she's actually alive, of course, because as we know, there's medication that she had to take that she needed, and there's not a
As
great
well as her
indication
pacemaker.
that she's had that. Yes, as well as her pacemaker, which again was disconnected as far as we know. So again, some very unfortunate signs on that front, along with some blood drips. It was confirmed to be her DNA on the front porch at her house. And Jake, as you mentioned, multiple ransom notes, which we would think were from the kidnapper. But again, as you mentioned, one of those was already confirmed to be false. It was a hoax. And a person in Los Angeles was already arrested in connection with one of those false ransom notes. And what we know up to this point, at least one of those ransom notes appears to be still in effect, requests $6 million in Bitcoin, again in ransom in exchange for the return of the family, return of their mother, Nancy Guthrie. And so that's what they've requested. Now the siblings put out multiple messages. Again, initially they they said, "Oh, we're willing to pay the ransom, but first we want proof that she's still alive." And they put out a more recent message saying, "We'll pay the ransom. Just send her back." And so that's the latest development on that front. But in terms of a solid person of interest and directly with the kidnapping, there hasn't been a great deal found, at least not yet, Jake.
Yes, and I think it's interesting that we don't necessarily have a person of interest for this case, but there's already an arrest that's been made. It seems like that would almost be the other way around. And so it seems at this point that the individual arrested in Los Angeles is more necessarily connected to the case, but not necessarily the guilty party. Is that what it appears is kind of the reason why that suspect was arrested?
Well, there's a possibility, though my understanding of that, as I mentioned, though, was that the person in Los Angeles arrested in connection with the ransom note was arrested for, again, a ransom note that was ultimately found to be a hoax. But again, not a lot of conclusive information on that point. And again, different people are speculating on that differently. So there's a possibility perhaps some would read into that more. Perhaps this person actually did have more of a connection with the actual crime, with the actual kidnapping. But again, no solid confirmation that they're connected directly with the kidnapping. And again, to the best of our knowledge, it was that ransom note that turned out to be a hoax that they were connected with and in turn arrested for. Jake?
Yeah, so based on what we know at this point in time, is it safe to say that there's a possibility, at least, that all of these ransom notes could be false at this point in time, but just maybe people trying to get some money out of the deal who are not really tied to the actual crime?
There's certainly a possibility of it, Jake, and it's looking somewhat likely at this point. Can't say that I would be terribly surprised by it, and we've already seen some discrepancy in this. Of course, the initial ransom note, the request from that initial ransom note, though it was found to be a hoax, as far as we know, is still in effect. Certainly, the family's doing all that they can. They're taking it seriously. If that's what they have to do to get their mother back, then they're willing to do that. And again, the deadline for that, for the ransom note, for that to be paid, to actually have their mother returned before it's too late, is 5 o'clock p.m. Today. So again, working on a very tight timeline, and again, just a very unfortunate, tragic situation. It's not abundantly clear what will happen this evening, though we have had indication that the family is willing to pay, and likely they were, and hopefully it doesn't turn out to be also a hoax. Hopefully it will result in the the return of their alive mother. Though again, unfortunately, as we mentioned, it's looking less and less likely at this point. Of course, because she has medication that she requires that it's unlikely that she was receiving in captivity. She has a pacemaker she requires, again, electronic pacemaker, which was connected with her phone. Again, that connection was ended a few days ago, so very unfortunate. Many people rely on these things to live. Seems to be the case. Seem to have been some under-relying cardiac issues, some health concerns with Nancy Guthrie. Certainly an older woman, 84 years old, and not in the best of health, so things are looking somewhat dire. And Jake, you mentioned the possibility that this could be a hoax. Well, it is looking more and more likely, and part of why I say that is because the initial request from that initial ransom note, which is now said to be a hoax, again, is still in effect. That initial request was the same one for that $6 million in Bitcoin. So again, that would point to the possibility of this being a hoax, is at least my reading of it, Jake.
Yes, and so kind of going back to that, so just for some clarification, when we mean $6 million in Bitcoin, we're talking about the US dollar conversion from the Bitcoin. So the request is made in Bitcoin, which means that it's about 86 Bitcoin. So the ransom note is requesting 86 Bitcoin, which is equivalent to 6 million US dollars.
Yes. Yes, very important note there, Jake, as you mentioned, and that, of course, is the conversion rate. Of course, depending on how you, of course, Bitcoin, sort of the attempt with cryptocurrency is to replace actual currencies such as the U.S. dollar. Some consider it a legitimate currency, whereas some consider it an asset. But again, similar to currency conversion rates, or if you will, similar to other investments, perhaps other assets, other holdings like stocks, different things. There is an exchange rate. Of course, they're asking for 6 million U.S. dollar equivalent, which turns out to be roughly 86.48 Bitcoin. So again, that being the equivalent there in U.S. dollars. Those who are interested in knowing exactly
Yeah,
what the exchange rate was on that, Jake.
and so this person who made this is requesting that it be made in Bitcoin, not $6 million. They're wanting 86.48 Bitcoin.
Yes, yes. So again, a very peculiar request, Jake. And again, you mentioned this a while ago, and I'm certainly with you on this. I've never heard of a ransom note in any of these situations requesting payment in Bitcoin. So that's an interesting choice. And again, Bitcoin, that is a relatively new thing. Again, the proponents of cryptocurrency suggest that being a sort of decentralized currency, or at least a decentralized alternative to currency, suggests that it would hold its value more steadily than something like the US dollar. Again, the U.S. dollar being again a pegged reserve currency. Um, so again, quite strong in the grand scheme of things in terms of currency exchange rates overall. But again, previously in the United States, not all that long ago, we had the policy of the gold standard in effect, where U.S. dollars were actually backed by physical gold, something with intrinsic value. That's no longer the case. Again, so the value isn't any longer determined by something with, say, precious metals of intrinsic value. So that changes things a bit. Again, that influences the value of the dollar to varying degrees. So perhaps the person, the kidnapper here, is a bit of a cryptocurrency fiend. Again, not a whole lot of other information on that. It is somewhat suspicious. Again, not all that common. And I don't know, perhaps from I guess the idea of the digital wallet with Bitcoin and different things like that, perhaps that is a bit more discreet. Perhaps the kidnapper would think they'd have an easier time getting away with cryptocurrency as opposed to having someone go physically accept a briefcase full of cash, as we've seen in the past. So, just some thoughts on that, Jake.
Yeah, and so I want to go ahead and look at kind of a different angle of the story, which of course is how this actually took place, when she went missing. And so it's been said that she first was discovered to have been missing last weekend. So it's been just a little over a week since this took place. And the first notice was someone claiming that she wasn't attending in-person services. That's how they first noticed that she was missing. What do we know about that, whether or not it's legitimate?
Well, that's a great question, Jake, and we've actually had some recent developments on that. But yes, you're right. That is something that was said initially when Nancy Guthrie went missing. Is that some of her friends at church mentioned that that was a bit unusual, that she had usually been there to attend those services at church, and now all of a sudden she wasn't there. But we've had some recent developments on that story that suggest otherwise. Some stories, some conflicting information here, actually, that suggest that she hadn't for some time attended church in person. She had actually been viewing services online. So again, what initially seemed to be fairly reliable information. Surely you would think, hearing this, again, this was a tip. This was not necessarily from Nancy Guthrie's friends directly that we know of. It could have been from someone else. Again, could have been a hoax. It could have been a hoax, that is. And that's what has been suggested a bit here in recent times. Of course, that was a tip given to the sheriff in the area about that on the whole case of the kidnapping, that her friends at church had mentioned not seeing her for some time, which was a bit odd for her, a bit out of character, unusual. And yet now we have conflicting sources that say, oh, she hadn't actually been attending church for years. She had actually been watching it online. So again, just one of the many questions in this tragic case. Jake?
Yes, yeah, certainly. And again, as we mentioned, one of the ransom notes did expire as of this afternoon, or is going to this afternoon. And just kind of I guess, a point of clarification is all of this information is updated as of lunchtime. So just keep that in mind that some of this is, of course, we record this before it actually gets posted. So understand that our information may just be a few hours out of date.
Absolutely. So, any of the folks at home who may not be aware on that, who may be watching this at a later time, again, for any of that information, again, to the best of our knowledge, at the time of recording, this is the most up to date information on the whole situation. Now, that said, naturally, this is an ongoing developing story. Very consequential one at that, so we will continue to cover that here on GWP News. And if there's any information on that in particular, or anything else you would like to contribute to GWP News, to the Great World Podcast, something for us to recover. But again, especially if you've got some information, perhaps some insight on the situation with this recent major kidnapping, then by all means reach out to us and give us a call. Again, the same way that we have Jake on the line now. Again, we periodically do GWP Live, where you can call in and ask some of those questions, contribute some information. But again, anytime that number will take you to our GWP offices. So if you've got any questions or any tips, any information you'd like to contribute, well, we would sure appreciate it. If you'd like to do that, the number to call in is 417 448 0819. Again, that number is 417 448 0819. Any information on that you've got would be much appreciated. Jake?
Yes, and a couple of other things. Of course, if you actually do have information that could be a lead into the investigation, obviously that would be information that you should report to the police as well. So make sure to do that. If you have any idea of what may have happened, maybe you have some more insight that hasn't already been discovered by the police. So that could always help them out. If you just happen to know something, that would also be good. And then also just one more point as well, you can also call or message that number to give your input on the GWP media question of the week.
Absolutely. Again, so very important information there, and we are going to have some upcoming opportunities on that with our new offering, GWP Question of the Week, which will be featured here on GWP News Weekly, sort of a new part of our newscast. If you want to check that out, any of those burning questions that you've got, great opportunity to have those answered. So again, at the very same number, 417 448 0819. Call and give us your questions. Again, that's 417 448 0819. So, Jake, as you mentioned, of course, in the air, if you had any really consequential, really groundbreaking information that you believe law enforcement hasn't gotten yet that would actually help them get to the bottom of this case, then by all means, don't reach out to us first. Reach out to the area sheriff's department. Again, that's in Arizona, I believe around the area of Tucson, Arizona. Isn't it, Jake? Does that sound right?
Yes, yeah, that's about right, I would say.
Yes. So certainly, again, for our viewers across the United States, any of those who happen to be in Arizona, especially, again, if you've got information to contribute to us, that's great. But by all means, if it's new, groundbreaking information, please don't go to us first. Go to law enforcement first. They need to know it more than we do. Jake?
Yes, and if you call an office that's in a different location, they, of course, will still report that information to the right spot. So keep that in mind as well.
Yes, naturally. So not to worry about that. Again, if we're not entirely correct on the location, again, believe that is the sheriff's department there in Tucson. But again, in any case, in the general area of Arizona, or quite frankly, anywhere across the country, if we were to call area law enforcement, they could pass that information along to the appropriate area, so not to fret about that. But again, if you've got any of that information to contribute, by all means, reach out and get that to law enforcement. And I reckon that covers a great deal of the extent in terms of the latest on that. Of course, as we mentioned today at 5 o'clock p.m., of course, this is in Arizona, so 5 o'clock p.m. Mountain Time, presumably, is the deadline for the latest ransom note. Again, as they say, it is the final deadline. So, very serious. Again, not a lot of conclusive information on that. At this point, that we have had indication, certainly repetitive indication from the family that they're willing to pay the ransom for their mother. So, most likely by that deadline at 5 o'clock tonight, they will have the ransom paid. Again, still unclear at this point whether that is legitimate, actually connected with the kidnapping, or this ransom is separate against someone else just looking to get $6 million in Bitcoin, which unfortunately would not be terribly surprising. But best case scenario, that ransom is paid, and Nancy Guthrie is um, returned home alive and well. Again, a great deal of speculation as to how likely that is, but one can only hope. So, certainly at this point, the Guthrie family could use prayers, all of you out there, in addition to that feedback for law enforcement. Though I do reckon, Jake, unless there's anything I left out on that, that covers the extent of the situation with the Nancy Guthrie kidnapping.
Yes, I would say that that pretty much does. And so again, of course, you can call that number if you have anything that you would like to add or see us cover. And so using that same line, of course, you can answer the GWP media question of the week. So we'll go ahead and reveal what the question of the week is. This will be posted through our YouTube channel later this evening, so you can actually have a writing of it. But here is the GWP media question of the week for this week. What did you think of the Super Bowl 60 commercials? Did they live up to your expectations? So that is the exact wording of our question of the week, our GWP media question of the week at 9 o'clock this evening. We will send over the copy of that, or I guess you could say the posting format that'll show you that question. But you can go ahead and call in with your response if you would like to hear it here on GWP News Weekly. And of course, we started this last week with our first question being about, should the state of Missouri raise the speed limit for rural interstates from 70 to 75 miles per hour? With that, I was able to take it to a few people across the city of Columbia on campus at Mizzou, and here are some of the responses that we got to last week's question of the week.
Yeah, I don't think it will harm, and it will be more efficient. So yes, I do think that Missouri should raise the speed limit.
I don't think that they should raise the speed limit because everybody speeds anyways. And so raising it even just 5 more, people are like, oh, I can go 10, 12 over and not be pulled over. Well, now that's 87, like 85, 87 miles per hour. And that's a lot. I'm just like frustrated with the construction because you go 70 speed limit, 55 speed limit, 70 speed limit, and like back and forth. And so you have to feel like you have to slow down, speed back up. So I think after the construction's done, keep it at 70. Like you don't need it any more than that.
I think that the speed limit should be raised. I'm on I-70 a lot. That's what I think of when I think of, raising. If we're going to do any of them, it would probably be I-70 that we raise the speed limit on. I-70 is so straight, and you can see for miles there really isn't a reason not to.
Yeah, and do you think that should take place after the construction is done on Interstate 70?
I would say so. There's from Kansas City to St. Louis in between there's I could probably count 10 places that are going under construction where the speed limit's only 55, and they monitor it pretty well too.
So that, of course, was the interviews that I went ahead and took from last week there in Columbia with two people in support with it and one opposed to changing the speed limit. There was also another gentleman that I talked to who was also against it. So we did have 2 people in favor, 2 people against it on raising the speed limit. So we'll have to see what the overall decision is later this summer, of course, with that one individual expressing concerns of just the safety implications that could come from raising the speed limit. And that was also mentioned by the other person that was off recording, I guess you could say.
I reckon that leads us into our next kind of major story here. Of course, this past Sunday, yesterday, we had the Super Bowl, of course, a major victory by the Seahawks there, with the Super Bowl contest being between the Seattle Seahawks and the New England Patriots. And again, some consequential information on that. Of course, we talked, one of our questions, our upcoming GWP weekly question, of course, Jake, as you mentioned just moments ago, it does relate to Super Bowl advertisements and kind of what you thought of those Super Bowl ads. So again, you want to weigh in on that if you've got any input. But as we know, again, Super Bowl is a major sporting event here in the United States, and one of the most viewed of all, even in terms of different televised events. Well, it's one of the very top ones, and some of those Super Bowl advertisements that we talk about, well, again, that is some of the best advertising you can get, just due to the sheer volume, just how many people watch the Super Bowl and are going to be seeing your ads. And so as a result, those advertisements are very expensive. Again, they try to fit those very short advertisement blocks into those time slots. Again, oftentimes going for millions of dollars for just a 30-second ad. And so with a budget like that, many of these companies, these ads are not cheap, needless to say. So again, if they focus on one advertisement, one form of marketing through the year, they're going to be advertising in the Super Bowl. Well, that may be an important one to focus on, producing a quality advertisement for that. So let us know if you think it measured up, if you think they quality advertisements, or if they left something to the imagination. So again, that just one of the notes on the Super Bowl. Artemis rocket launch, or a scheduled Artemis rocket launch, again, a space mission. So again, an interesting development there, and something that we haven't seen a major U.S. space mission, that is, in some time. But Jake, it's my understanding that they had some difficulties with that, perhaps some weather interference, and they've had to push back that launch date. They've had to postpone it, to reschedule it. Is that right?
Yes, and so it's kind of interesting. The day that we actually covered this news story is the day when it got delayed. It was later that day that it was just a few hours after we reported the newscast that it was reported that the wet dress rehearsal, there was a few problems. One of the problems was that there was fluids that were leaking out of it. There was also some communication issues when it came to getting back to land, like communicating back on Earth. So there was some communication problems. And then it was also just going to be too cold to launch it last week. So, of course, the date has been pushed back about a month to ensure that those technical difficulties are resolved, as well as warmer weather will likely be on the horizon by the month of March. So it was pushed back for that reason.
Yes, of course, the wet dress rehearsal, where all of those involved are required to be completely soaked before participating. Well, no. Again, certain industry language there. I can't say that I've heard a great deal, Jake, and many of the folks at home, perhaps, I don't know, in my case, certainly haven't heard that term a great deal. Now, in terms of this, obviously, this refers essentially to practice for the launch. Again, getting things in order. It's important that they are prepared for that, so it makes sense that they do a practice or rehearsal, dress rehearsal type thing, if you will. But in the industry, Jake, do you know what exactly is meant by a wet dress rehearsal?
Yeah, so it has to do with just making sure that everything is really good to go with the spacecraft, is really kind of what it is. And so, of course, when that rehearsal, I guess you could say, was done, there were some problems, of course, as we mentioned, that came up. And so we'll continue to provide any updates in future weeks as we get closer to the actual launch or the delayed launch of Artemis 2.
Yes, yes, interesting. So presumably have different terms, different types. If this is a wet dress rehearsal, is there also a dry dress rehearsal? Not sure. Again, not sure if you would happen to know, Jake, or if any of the folks at home would happen to know. If you do, well, we're curious. Let us know. You may even be featured on a future edition of GWP News Weekly. So let us know, what exactly is a wet dress rehearsal, and why the distinction? What are the other types of dress rehearsals, as it were, in the industry? That about concludes our news segment. Up next is weather. Alrighty, glad to see that you made it back in one piece, Jake. Back here, it looks like, so we can have some of those maps displayed for the folks at home, all of our viewing audience. What is our weather forecast looking like for the week ahead?
Yeah, so we'll go ahead and we'll look at some weather here. So, of course, we've got some red flag warnings for the risk of fires across a few of our areas across the desert Southwest here, getting into the central plains here into Nebraska. And then the flood watch, you normally don't see that next to a red flag warning. That is because of some of the snow melt. We've actually had some ice jams that's been taking place. A little bit of snow further to the north, some air quality alerts to along the Gulf Coast here, and then some winter weather alerts out west as we have some snow across the Sierras, which we certainly need some snow out there. As we mentioned last week, a bit of a drought is ongoing across that region here. As we look at our power outages right now, we're at 46,000 customers. So this number has come down quite a bit over the last couple of weeks since that ice storm moved out. California is at the top of our list at about 9,800 customers. Mississippi, 9,100. Texas at about 3,500. Hawaii also in the top five at 3,300. Missouri, in fact, is in the top five states at 2,400 customers without power. The majority of those right now are in Clay County. Of course, that from poweroutage.com. So that's what our power outages are looking at this point in time. So not too many, but just a few areas that have some hit or miss power outages.
Absolutely, certainly worth noting in a light of recent storms and weather impacting that. Certainly, we didn't get the worst of it in Missouri in terms of power outages, though, as you mentioned, further south down in Texas, they had quite a bit of power outage as a result of some of that winter weather that they received. So, again, in terms of power outages here in Missouri, we've got a few of them sprinkled in some of those areas, but could be much worse. Jake?
Yeah, so that's kind of what we're looking at right now. Now we'll kind of look at the next few days. We're going to stay dry and on the warmer side. We're even looking at record high temperatures here across Missouri. All of that wintry weather is staying locked across the Northeast here, where we will have a weak storm system that will be moving through Tuesday night. This is the 12Z GFS run from February 9th from tropicaltidbits.com. So the morning run, the Monday morning run, showing some snowfall in here as we go into Tuesday and Wednesday. Of course, New York City still digging out after one of the biggest winter storms in the decade across that area. So still recovering there from that winter storm. This appears to be staying as all rain for New York City, but anywhere north of New York City, that's where we could be looking at some snowfall and then even a little bit of lake effect snow as we go into Wednesday night and to Thursday as well. Of course, lake effect snow is a little bit less this time of year because those lakes are frozen over, but some of those open lakes could still lead to a little bit of lake effect snow as we go into Thursday. As far as snowfall amounts, what are we looking at? Closer to the Great Lakes in the upstate of New York, we're looking at the possibility of a couple areas picking up anywhere from about 6 to 10 inches across that region. The rest of New England probably looking at lighter amounts of around 2 to 4 inches expected from Boston up into New Hampshire as well as Maine. Again, as we mentioned, New York City, not a whole lot of accumulation is expected there. So that's some snowfall potential that we're going to have across the Northeast. What about here across Missouri? We could have a slight chance for some rain Tuesday night. Not expect it to be a big deal. No winter weather chances this week. So that is certainly good news after all the colder air and all the ice and snow that we had across the South and here across Missouri as well. But you'll notice that a much bigger storm system is going to move just to the south of us here across Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana. We need to watch the possibility of the weekend of Valentine's, which of course this weekend is Valentine's Day. We could be looking at the risk of some thunderstorms, maybe even a slight risk for some tornadic activity. The good news is the majority of that should stay to our south across Arkansas and points further to the south, but we could get some decent amount of rain across the state of Missouri. This particular model, again, the GFS model, is not showing a whole lot of rain across the state of Missouri. Some of the other models have been hinting at a little bit more rainfall. So there is a slight chance of some heavier rainfall as we go into this weekend, even the possibility of some storms, maybe even severe storms further to our south along the Gulf Coast.
Absolutely, some very important information to know there. Headed into our week again, Missouri's still not getting the worst of this. Any storm, any severe weather to be expected. Missouri is largely, it looks like, going to be able to avoid, Jake. But as you mentioned, some of that weather heading through Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana. Was that right?
Yes, in fact, if we look at that precipitation forecast through this weekend, this goes Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Again, we are looking at the possibility of some heavier totals across Oklahoma, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Tennessee, possibly getting upwards of around 4 to 6 inches of rain across this region. Much lighter totals, probably staying under a half an inch here across the state of Missouri. So a lot of that heavy rain and flooding will stay to our south. And then the other big story this week is going to be out west, finally seeing some wintry weather across the Sierra Mountains, as we mentioned with those winter weather advisories. This is Tuesday night into Wednesday. We could be picking up some snow across California. That's then going to move into the Rockies as we go into Wednesday and Thursday. So we've been in a bit of a drought across this region, but from drought to deluge, that seems to be the story as we go into the middle part of this week, even into the early part of next week. We could be looking at an even larger atmospheric river event that could bring even heavier amounts of snowfall across this region. As far as how much snow is expected, here's going just through Friday. So this is through Friday, some of the heavier totals across the state of California, getting a couple of feet of snow across that region. The Rockies could also pick up a decent amount of snow. Even a little bit of light snow across the northern plains is expected. And then as we go into next week, these totals will likely continue to increase again. Um, I would ignore these numbers. That seems a little bit extreme. 123 inches. That seems a little bit high. So, not necessarily paying attention to the numbers, just the overall trend that we are expecting much more heavier snowfall chances, or chances for heavier snowfall rather, across the western states.
Absolutely. That does seem like a bit much, Jake. 123 inches. So probably won't get quite that much in the area. But in any case, there seems it will be a bit of snow. Jake?
Yeah. Yeah, now it is possible that we could get close to 100 inches over a couple of weeks because it is in the higher elevations, but certainly a little bit on the higher side. So that's kind of a look at our precipitation. What about the temperature outlook from the GFS model? We're going to be staying above average, and more above average. It's pretty much the same thing, staying anywhere from about 5 to 15 degrees above average for this week here across the state of Missouri. You'll notice that the 6 to 10 day outlook is definitely in support of that going in the long range. This is going from this Saturday, the 14th, through February 18th. And the name of the game is going to be above average temperatures, really from the Rockies and points east, a little bit below average across the western part of the U.S., where we're expecting those heavier snowfall chances across the mountain ranges out west. Precipitation likely going to be really above average across the western part of the country, but even slightly above average for us. So, again, that's an indication of that rainfall that we could see this weekend. If we go further out, February 16th through the 22nd, still staying above average, central and eastern U.S., western U.S. below average. Precipitation is pretty much the same as well. As we're not going to show it because it just pretty much is the same thing. Of course, this is from the Climate Prediction Center, NOAA, uh, putting out these graphics. And then as we look at that week 3 to 4 outlook, likely staying above average even towards the end of the month and going into that first week of March. So this isn't to say that we won't have any wintry weather, but the odds are definitely, at least compared to historical averages, the odds are very low that we'll get any precipitation in the form of winter weather in the near term.
Absolutely, Jake. Some great information there on different weather events to expect in the coming week. And as you mentioned, we're heading into some more warmer weather than we've seen here recently in our area, certainly across southwest Missouri. You mentioned 5 to 15 degrees above average temperatures for this time of year, which is just what we mentioned even as far back as our snow cover, our winter storm, snowstorm coverage here on GWP, on GWP Live. And again, that's what we suggested. Again, there's going to be a snowstorm, a fair bit of it here for a while, but it won't last long, and we'll be headed back into some warmer weather. Well, folks, you heard it here first. Truly, throughout the week, throughout the months, again, naturally, there's only so much we can do. As we've mentioned previously, the further out the weather predictions are, but in any case, truly, tomorrow's weather today, just one of the many offerings of GWP News Weekly. So you want to keep tuning in for that to stay up to date on that, not only on the weather, but on the latest news and sporting events. Jake?
Yes, and so now we'll go ahead and round things out with that hazardous outlook for the next 8 to 14 days. And I'm a little bit concerned about what the hazardous outlook is showing, at least out west right now. This is showing that there is a high risk from Monday through next Monday through next Tuesday, February 16th and 17th, a high risk of above normal precipitation. So it is good that we're seeing rain and snow out west because of that drought concern. This should help things out as far as keeping our wildfire season on the lower side if we can get enough moisture. So that is certainly a good thing, but too much of a good thing can become a bad thing. And that, of course, is what we're concerned about out west as we go into the early part of next week. So we could see just a little bit too much precipitation out west. So that's something that we'll have to watch from that atmospheric river event. As we mentioned, the risk for heavy snow is also correlating with that here across the Sierra Mountains. There is a high risk from next Monday through Wednesday that we could see very heavy snowfall amounts. We're talking feet of snow across the Sierras is going to be possible. It's hard to say exactly how much, but I would say probably at least 3 feet of snow next week across the Sierras, probably closer to 4 to 8 feet. So we don't have exact numbers on that yet. So if you're not prepared for these atmospheric river events out west, you certainly need to make those preparations this week because things appear to be getting a lot worse as we go into next week, at least when it comes to those atmospheric river events. The last thing that we'll show here is that western Missouri is in the slight risk for high winds going from next Monday through next Friday, the 20th. So that's something else that we'll have to watch, with the biggest risk of winds is going to be across the Rockies from next Monday through Wednesday, with that moderate risk issued from NOAA's National Weather Service Climate Prediction Center outlooks.
Absolutely. We'll continue to follow that here on GWP News. So that is all on weather for now. Up next is sports. And now for a look at some recent major sporting events. Of course, a big week for that. We just had the Super Bowl yesterday. Naturally, we also have the Winter Olympics going on. Get some scoring updates on that. All that and much more here on our sports segment on GWP News Weekly, Jake. So, what are we starting off with?
Yeah, so we'll start off with the Super Bowl. Of course, we briefly looked at the question of the week, which relates to the commercials during the Super Bowl, or at least during, obviously in between when the Super Bowl was happening during the commercial breaks. And so, of course, we looked at that, but we didn't necessarily look at the Super Bowl itself. And so, in case you didn't know this, spoiler alert, the 60th Super Bowl ended with the Seahawks winning. The final score in that game was 29 Seattle versus the Patriots 13. This is Seattle's second Super Bowl win. There was also one record that was broken. Seattle ended up with the most field goals that any field goal kicker has ever kicked in a Super Bowl. So that was another kind of interesting stat, as that Seattle kicked 5 field goals during the game.
Absolutely. So 29-13 wasn't even close. The Seahawks victory. And again, Jake, you mentioned this to me. A bit of a shakeup, certainly throughout the season. We've seen a bit of a shakeup in the NFL, and as you mentioned, of course, the Patriots have actually won a fair few Super Bowls. So it was interesting to see kind of how it shook out. But that said, again, there were predictions naturally beforehand, and the Seahawks were favored considerably to win. And turns out that's what happened. A real shocker. But again, those predictions they don't always turn out to be turned out to hold up through the game. Again, admittedly, not quite so interesting. It'd be interesting to see kind of across the area what viewership was like, and we'll get to the overall Super Bowl viewership from this year. And again, they're still working on the numbers, but again, we will be covering that here before long and what the viewership is like. That's kind of central to our question about the Super Bowl commercials. Again, some of the most viewed commercials ever. The Super Bowl, again, millions of viewers, huge sporting event. So, again, certainly worth noting on that front. But perhaps in our local area, Jake, I suspect it may be a bit down on account of the Chiefs, of course, having a role in the past few Super Bowls, certainly over the past few years. Those calls for much more viewership, kind of in our regional area here, and there are different ways, sort of, at measuring that. Of course, there's the natural sort of way of polling, sort of asking around in terms of who all viewed it. And again, there are other signs. If you look around your local area, certainly businesses across the city don't seem to be as busy. Certainly in the case around this area, almost nothing going on across the area. Whenever the Chiefs are in the Super Bowl, I suspect that was a bit different this past Super Bowl seems to have been. But Jake, any other major takeaways from the big game yesterday?
Yeah, so just a few other kind of quick things on that. Of course, Seattle started off the game with a couple of field goals, so it was a pretty good defensive struggle between both of the teams, or both teams were pretty good there with defense. Seattle then took the lead 12, or I guess it was 9-0 at halftime, and then of course Seattle kicked another field goal in the third quarter, making it 12-0. So it was really just all about the field goals for quite some time. And then eventually Seattle put the first touchdown on the board late in the third quarter, making it 19-0. New England did try to make a comeback. They scored a touchdown, making it 19-7 with about 12 to 11-ish minutes left in the game. And then it was kind of back and forth with the possessions. Seattle then kicked another field goal. That was after there was a pass intercept, or there was an interception that took place. And then Seattle took control, kicked the field goal 22-7. That, of course, is when they had the most field goals in Super Bowl history. And then we had Seattle scored again 29-7 after there was a fumble recovery, turned it back for a touchdown. Then it was 29-7 with 4 minutes left in the game. New England scored, making it a two-possession game, 29-13. They tried for a two-point conversion with 2 minutes left in the game, and then that failed. And so then they tried an onside kick in order to stay alive. That was unsuccessful. There was less than a minute left in the game, and then New England had a chance to score, and then the clock expired, which made Seattle the winners of that game at 29-13. Of course, this was a rematch of Super Bowl 49 in which New England won, so Seattle certainly got their I guess you could say revenge from that loss from 11 years ago. Well, of course, that game was on NBC and Peacock, with the location being the home of the San Francisco 49ers. Peacock and NBC has certainly been covering a lot, including this year's Olympics, which we'll kind of go over that just a little bit here. That's our next big story with sports. Of course, so far, the United States has only had 2 medals so far, but they were really big victories as they were both gold medals. Currently, the country with the most medals is Italy, currently sitting at 9 medals. 6 of those are bronze, 2 silver, and 1 gold. Currently, we've got Norway and Switzerland are tied with the most gold medals. Norway is at 3 gold medals. Switzerland is also at 3. Norway has more medals than Switzerland at 6. Switzerland has 4. Of course, there's still quite a bit left as the Winter Olympics go all the way through Sunday, February 22nd. Of course, there's 92 nations that are competing as well, with over 2,800 athletes are competing this year in the Olympics. So that, of course, has been a big story. Of course, as we mentioned, the U.S. has already secured 2 gold medals within the opening weekend of the Olympics. That one of those was earned by Breezy Johnson in the women's downhill alpine skiing at the U.S. And then also the U.S. team in figure skating won the other gold medal. So that's been the success so far just in the opening weekend of the Winter Olympics.
Absolutely. So, congratulations to Team USA. First few uh, gold medals, again, just in the opening weekend of the Winter Olympics. Again, so it still is early on, and certainly is the possibility, even the likelihood of more of those. And Jake, as you mentioned, sort of seems to be a common theme across this broadcast. Of course, we mentioned the Super Bowl this year. NBC had licensing to air the Super Bowl, which the different major networks, the big three, as it were, sort of take turns hosting, televising the Super Bowl from year to year. And it was their turn at NBC, which also happens to be hosting and televising the Winter Olympics. Now, of course, another tie to NBC, tragically, that we mentioned earlier on in our news segment, which you can rewind for if you didn't catch previously, though. Again, one of the anchors at NBC regularly hosts the Today Show, Savannah Guthrie. Unfortunately, her mother was kidnapped. There is an ongoing investigation on that. We will continue to follow on GWP News. But if you didn't catch that information previously, maybe rewind, check it out. Jake?
Yes, and so of course we also had some tragic news, or not necessarily tragic, but just really bad news, I guess you could say, within the Olympics during that alpine skiing. Of course, Breezy Johnson becoming only the second woman to win a gold medal in that particular sport for the United States. But of course, the woman who won the first gold medal in that particular sport was also competing. She won it back in 2010. Of course, we're talking about Lindsey Vonn, and Lindsey Vonn was competing competing this year with or against Breezy Johnson as well, also for Team USA. And she was going on a torn ACL and unfortunately had quite a crash in the middle of her performance on the mountain and even had to be airlifted out of there. So we're also praying that things may work out for Lindsey Vonn after that severe crash that took place yesterday in the Olympics. Of course, the positive side of that was that Breezy Johnson for USA was able to still take home the gold for the US in that sporting event.
Absolutely, Jake. As you mentioned, fortunately, Team USA was still able to secure a gold medal in that category. But again, no less unfortunate that a competitor there was injured quite severely. You mentioned already competing with a torn ACL and had quite the wreck, had to be airlifted out of there. So very unfortunate. Of course, already had a track record with the Olympics, winning gold medal. You said back in 2010. Again, went back to give it another shot, and things didn't end quite as well as they might have. So again, prayers for the athlete and her family, makes a rapid recovery from that as we continue
Yes.
to follow the Winter Olympics. Jake?
Yes, and so that wraps things up on sports since we are running just a little bit short on time. So now we'll go ahead and we'll move into the GWP Weekly Surprise, which also kind of relates to sports as well. The GWP Weekly Surprise this week is the fact that in men's college basketball, Arizona has not lost a game all season with less than 1 month of the regular season left to go. Arizona is 23-0 on a 23 game win streak. Also, another big surprise, Miami, Ohio is undefeated as well, ranked number 23. They're currently 24-0, a team that just isn't really well known for basketball. And so, really big success story for them. On the women's side of things, UConn also is undefeated, 25-0 on that 25 game win streak. So, another really big surprise on the women's side as well, with just less than a month of the season left to go before those tournaments begin. And then before you know it, in the end of March, March Madness will begin as well. So that shocking story is our GWP weekly surprise for this week. And that'll wrap things up as well. We'll see you next week.